The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge, a sound Rachel Torres had learned to filter out the way soldiers learn to ignore incoming mortar rounds, present, persistent, but no longer demanding conscious acknowledgement. She wiped marinara sauce from the vinyl booth seat at table 6, her movements economical and precise, the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory older than her current job. Water glass. Napkin. Check the exit. Water glass. Napkin. Check the exit. Her hands moved through the sequence without her mind directing them, the left one tremoring slightly when she reached for the highball glass, old shrapnel, old nerves, old wounds that had learned to speak in tiny vibrations whenever her cortisol spiked. Salvatore's Italian kitchen occupied a corner storefront on East Main Street in Norfolk, the kind of place where red sauce stained the tablecloths and the jukebox played Dean Martin on an endless loop. Vinyl booths, checkered curtains that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration, Christmas lights strung across the kitchen window in July. The dinner rush had peaked 20 minutes ago, and now the restaurant held the comfortable lull of early evening, a handful of couples splitting plates of ravioli, an elderly man in the corner booth working through his third martini, a young family with 2 kids who had somehow managed to scatter Cheerios across 3 tables simultaneously. Vincent, the manager, stood behind the host station pretending to look busy while actually monitoring the dining room like it was a surveillance operation, which, Rachel had noted, he treated with the seriousness of someone protecting classified intelligence. Rachel's jacket hung on the hook in the kitchen office, a worn canvas thing the color of faded denim, the sleeves slightly too long because she had bought it at a thrift store in Fairfax County 6 months ago when she needed something that looked civilian. Inside the left lining, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a patch. Faded olive drab fabric with a curled scroll border and the words 75th Ranger Regiment embroidered in pale gold thread that had survived 7 years, 3 combat tours, and 1 classified reassignment that had ended in a handoff that never happened. The patch was the kind of thing people wore on berets or displayed in shadow boxes. Rachel kept it where no one would ever think to look, where it whispered its story to only her, the way scars tell stories only to the body that carries them. She straightened from the booth and carried the dirty glass to the kitchen, weaving between Vincent's careful not quite blocking and the pass where the sous chef was calling out ticket times like a drill sergeant. The kitchen smelled like garlic and olive oil and the specific heat signature of a flat-top grill that had been running since lunch service. She set the glass in the bus tub and moved toward table 8, already scanning for what needed clearing, muscle memory again, the same way she had once scanned rooftops in Fallujah for the glint of optics or the squared-off outline of a rifle muzzle. The door chimed. New customers. Rachel didn't look up, but her peripheral vision caught movement, a man in a charcoal suit and a woman in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Rachel made in a month at minimum wage. High institutional authority in his posture. His wife held his arm the way spouses do when they're navigating a space that belongs more to the man than to them. Vincent's energy shifted immediately. Rachel recognized the change the way she recognized the sound of an incoming helicopter, sudden alertness, the social equivalent of a jump to full operational status. Dr. Mercer. Welcome back. We have your favorite table ready. Vincent was already moving, gesturing them toward the booth with the clearest sight line to the kitchen, the booth that happened to have a direct view of table 7 where Rachel was refilling water glasses. Rachel kept her eyes on the task. Water pitcher. Water glass. Check exit. The exit was behind her and to the left, the fire door that led to the alley where the dumpsters lived. She had mapped all of them on her first shift, 3 months ago now, though it felt longer. Always know the exits. Always know the distance to the door. These were not civilian habits. These were the kinds of habits that kept people alive in places where the sky could kill you. The man was staring at her now. She felt it the way animals feel approaching predators, not through any single sense but through the sum total of her nervous system recognizing a threat vector. Not a physical threat. Something else. Something institutional and deliberate. Rachel continued pouring water for table 8, her hand steady, her expression neutral in that particular way of people who had learned composure in rooms where flinching meant dying. Vincent. The man's voice carried the kind of authority that came from having spent years making decisions that affected other people's careers. How long has that nurse been working here? Vincent's throat worked slightly. He was not a good liar. That's Rachel. She's been with us for about 3 months. Great worker. Very reliable. That's the temp from Seattle General. The one I mentioned. The man, Dr. Marcus Mercer, Chief Nursing Officer, the kind of administrator who had the ability to ruin people's professional lives with a single phone call to the right people, leaned back in his booth and continued watching her the way a predator watches prey that hasn't yet realized it's been identified. Rachel felt the weight of his attention the way she felt the weight of IED concern on patrol routes that had been hit before. Pressure. Focused. Patient. She set the water pitcher on the service station, moved to the next table, continued working. This was the part nobody talked about when they talked about surviving difficult situations. You just kept moving. You kept your hands busy. You kept breathing in the rhythm that had worked for you in medical tents under indirect fire. In and hold for 4. Out for 6. In and hold for 4. Out for 6. The body remembers. Vincent was still standing near their booth, explaining the specials with the enthusiasm of a man who knew he had made some kind of social miscalculation and was desperately trying to correct course. The wild boar risotto is exceptional tonight. Chef sourced it from a new supplier up in Pennsylvania. Rachel moved to table 2, where an empty martini glass sat waiting like a small monument to someone's bad decision-making. She picked it up along with the scattered cocktail napkins, the olive garnish, the remnants of ice. The older man had moved on to reading his newspaper. He never made conversation. Rachel liked him for that. She liked people who understood that quiet was sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone. The kitchen door swung open behind her and Tommy, one of the other servers, nearly collided with her carrying a tray of osso buco. Whoa. Sorry, Rach. He was in college, studying business administration, the kind of person for whom this job was temporary and therefore manageable. He had no idea that some people got stuck in temporary situations and could never quite claw their way back out. He passed, calling an order to Vincent without breaking stride. The temperature of the dining room shifted slightly as Dr. Mercer followed Tommy's movement toward a table on the opposite side of the restaurant, then looked back at Rachel. That was when she felt it most directly, the moment when someone's attention becomes intent. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the clock on the wall. 6:47 p.m. 3 hours and 13 minutes until closing. She had learned, a long time ago, in a place where time was measured in how many minutes of consciousness you had left, how to segment duration into manageable units. You couldn't think about surviving the whole night. You could think about surviving the next hour. You could think about surviving the next 30 minutes. You could think about surviving the next table. Rachel moved toward the kitchen, past the open office where her jacket hung like a flag no one recognized, and started wiping down the prep counter. Vincent appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in the way people look when they know they've made a mistake but aren't sure how bad it's going to be. That's the Chief Nursing Officer from Seattle General, he said quietly. The one who, he stopped himself, clearly realizing he was about to say something that violated some unspoken code of workplace discretion. Rachel continued wiping the counter. The cloth moved across the stainless steel in even strokes, pushing the day's debris toward the edge where it could be collected and discarded. Okay. He came in last week. Asked if you still worked here. I said yes. He left after 15 minutes. Okay, Rachel said again, and she meant it. She had encountered plenty of people with institutional authority. She had learned, in places with names like Jolin District and Sanjan Valley, that most of them wanted one of two things, compliance or removal. She was good at providing both. She had spent 7 years learning how to be invisible to people who had the power to unmake you. A chief nursing officer in a Norfolk restaurant was just another person trying to consolidate power in the smallest possible sphere. They always did. They always would. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that 3 miles away, at Norfolk Memorial Hospital, a man lay in room 417 with compartmentalized intelligence locked in his head like a safe deposit box, and Rachel had been tasked, quietly, through channels that didn't officially exist, by people whose job titles were classified, with monitoring his recovery because he was an Army Ranger medic named Garrett who had been on the same fire base she'd been pulled from 6 years ago for a classified tasking that she still wasn't allowed to discuss at dinner parties or in therapy. He was the one person in Norfolk who could confirm her actual identity, the one person who could blow her cover entirely, and he was currently under observation by 3 different government agencies because the intelligence he carried was the kind that made people nervous enough to deploy assets like Rachel Torres to a restaurant on East Main Street to wait for situations that needed her specific skill set. Dr. Mercer had never understood what he was looking at when he looked at her that afternoon at the hospital. He had seen a temp nurse without Ivy League credentials, someone with patient satisfaction scores that inexplicably exceeded those of his tenured staff, someone whose very existence seemed to be a quiet indictment of his own relevance. He had seen a problem to solve. What he didn't see was the woman who had performed a resuscitative hysterotomy in a medical tent in Ramadi while rounds came in from 3 directions. He didn't see the medic who had stayed with a dying soldier for 18 minutes, holding his hand while his body shut down, never leaving him alone, never breaking eye contact, never flinching. He didn't see Captain Rachel Torres. He saw a disruption in his institutional hierarchy, and disruptions, in Dr. Marcus Mercer's experience, were things that could be eliminated. Vincent had left the kitchen, heading back out to the dining room, back to his carefully neutral demeanor. Rachel set down her cloth and looked at her hands, scarred knuckles from training, a thin line of scar tissue across her left palm from shrapnel that had missed tendons by millimeters, fingernails permanently stained from industrial soap and the kind of work that demanded both precision and endurance. These were not the hands of someone who had learned her trade in a university hospital. These were the hands of someone who had learned it in a place where you had 30 seconds to make a decision that meant the difference between someone going home or going home in a flag-draped box. The clock ticked forward. In and hold for 4. Out for 6. Rachel Torres picked up her apron and headed back toward the dining room where Dr. Marcus Mercer was sitting in his booth, thinking about phone calls he was going to make and conversations he was going to have with people who had the power to ruin people's professional lives. He had no idea what was about to walk through the door. Dr. Marcus Mercer arrived at Salvatore's on a Tuesday evening with his wife, and Rachel knew the moment she saw him that the hospital had followed her here. He sat 3 booths from the kitchen, navy blazer draped over the chair like a second skin, the kind of expensive fabric that whispered old money and older resentments. Rachel had learned to read people the way combat medics read vital signs. It was survival. She recognized the set of his jaw, the way his eyes tracked her movements across the dining room. He was hunting. The first thing he did was order water without acknowledging her existence. She poured it anyway, her movements precise, economical. When she set the glasses down, his voice cut through the ambient noise of clinking silverware and low conversation like a blade through membrane. It's remarkable what people will do when they can't cut it in real medicine. He wasn't speaking to Rachel. He was performing. Slinging pasta instead of saving lives. Must be quite a fall from grace. His wife shifted in her seat, uncomfortable with the volume, with the cruelty disguised as casual observation. Rachel set the menu down without a word. Her hands were steady. Her breathing steady. The tremor would come later, in the walk-in cooler, but not here. Never here. I heard the board suspended her license, Mercer continued, speaking now to the other diners within earshot. Building an audience the way architects build walls, foundation first, then the trap. Falsified clinical hours, they say. Probably couldn't handle the pressure of real nursing. Some people just aren't equipped for excellence. Rachel's hand trembled once as she steadied the water pitcher. She caught it, controlled it, met his eyes with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived worse. Your menus are on the table, Dr. Mercer. I'll give you a moment. One tear traced her cheekbone, and she wiped it without breaking eye contact. I've followed worse leaders into worse places, Mr. Hendricks. They had the excuse of taking fire. She turned away before he could respond, her pace measured, her shoulders level. Behind her, she heard his wife ask him what that meant. Mercer didn't answer. he was already reaching for his phone, pulling out the Virginia Board of Medicine number from his contacts. He had it memorized, which told Rachel everything she needed to know about how long he'd been planning this. 3 tables away, a family of 4 watched the exchange unfold. An elderly couple 2 booths over exchanged glances. The room didn't go dead silent. It was too early in the evening for that, too crowded with the ordinary noise of people eating and talking, but something had shifted in the air, the way pressure changes before a storm. Rachel could feel it moving through the restaurant like a current, the story already spreading, already taking shape in the minds of strangers who had just witnessed a public crucifixion dressed up as casual conversation. Mercer's voice was audible enough for the adjacent tables. "Yes, this is Dr. Marcus Mercer, Chief Nursing Officer at Seattle General. I'm calling regarding the Rachel Torres case. I'm providing additional testimony. Patient safety is paramount, and I have concerns about her clinical judgment that the board should be aware of." He paused, listening to whoever answered. "The specifics?" "Medication administration errors. Failure to follow protocol. And a pattern of deception about her qualifications." "Yes, I have documentation." He didn't have documentation. Rachel knew this with the certainty of someone who had lived honestly. But the lie was already in motion, already becoming a thing that people would repeat, that would acquire the weight of truth through repetition alone. This was how reputations died, not in dramatic collapse, but in the slow poisoning of consensus, one whispered doubt at a time. Rachel finished her shift for hours later. She didn't make eye contact with Vincent, the manager. She didn't acknowledge the stares from other servers who had heard the exchange, who were already doing the calculus of association. Was it safe to be seen with her, or would that taint them too? The break room was empty when she retrieved her jacket. It would be empty every break from that night forward. 3 days passed. Rachel worked her shifts at Salvatore's, and the atmosphere had thickened into something hostile and suffocating. On Friday afternoon, she sat in the back staff room during her break, a small windowless space that smelled of industrial bleach and desperation. Her coffee had gone cold in the time it took to sit down. She was alone for approximately 90 seconds before 2 waitresses, Lisa and Jennifer, both of whom had worked alongside her without incident, gathered their purses and left without a word. The dishwasher Oscar paused in the doorway, his expression caught between sympathy and self-preservation. He followed them out. Rachel sat motionless, her hand wrapped around the cooling mug. In her locker above the break room bench hung a photograph, faded to sepia at the edges, showing 15 men and women in desert camouflage standing in front of a Phi-base medical tent. Half those faces belonged to people who no longer existed, whose names she could still recite in the order they died. Captain Sarah Vance, IED, Jolin District, March 2009. Sergeant Miguel Reyes, Direct Fire, Sniper Nest, April 2009. Corporal James Chen, Infection, Insufficient Antibiotics, June 2009. The photo was a casualty list written in flesh and uniform, and she kept it because forgetting would be a greater betrayal than remembering. The poisoning accelerated through the following week. Mercer made additional calls to people he knew at the Virginia Board of Medicine, each one adding another layer of manufactured doubt. Rachel learned later, much later, that he had contacted hospital administrators, suggested that her suspension was a favor to a dangerous professional, that her background was murky and potentially fabricated. He had implied, without quite stating it explicitly, that she might have falsified her entire employment history. The precision of his attack suggested he had been planning this for months, waiting for leverage, for the moment when her existence at Seattle General became untenable and he could justify her removal to anyone who asked. But Rachel's composure was a weapon he didn't understand. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't acceptance. It was the practiced restraint of someone who had learned that showing pain gave enemies ammunition. The tremor in her hands appeared only when she was alone, in the shower, in her apartment at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling. In public, she was stone. She was command presence. She was the kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable because they sensed, without knowing why, that she had seen things that would break normal people. Friday of the second week brought the moment Mercer had been constructing like an architect designs a building meant to collapse from within. Rachel was moving through the dining room carrying a tray of entrees when she saw him enter with Vincent, the restaurant manager. They were having a conversation she couldn't hear, but she could read Mercer's body language, the way he gestured with his hands, the way he was building his case with the deliberate precision of someone who had done this before, many times, to many people. They intercepted her near the kitchen, where half the dining room could still see, but the noise level provided cover for what was about to happen. Mercer held up his phone, showing Vincent something on the screen. "Mr. Vincent, I feel obligated to inform you that this woman is under investigation for professional misconduct. She endangered patients at Seattle General through gross negligence. I have the board letter right here." His voice was moderate, reasonable, the tone of a concerned colleague sharing important information. "I'd hate for your establishment to face any liability associated with employing someone under active investigation." Families at 3 nearby tables had stopped eating. A man with his back to Rachel turned his head slightly, eavesdropping. Vincent's face had gone pale, the way faces do when someone has just suggested that your business might collapse due to forces completely outside your control. Rachel stood perfectly still, her breathing even, her hands at her sides. She absorbed the words the way a sponge absorbs water, completely, without resistance, without the luxury of refusal. A single tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it calmly with her thumb, maintaining eye contact with Mercer as she did. "The board hasn't made findings, Dr. Mercer. But you've already made yours, haven't you?" Her voice was quiet enough that only he and Vincent could hear it. "That's how this works. You decide first, then you gather evidence to match the conclusion." Mercer's expression flickered, surprise, then satisfaction. He had broken her. He believed this because she had cried, because she had shown a crack in the facade. He didn't understand that a single tear was the extent of what she would give him, that everything else would be sealed away behind a wall that no amount of social pressure could penetrate. Vincent asked her to take the rest of the night off. He said it gently, apologetically, but the message was unmistakable: her presence was now a liability. Rachel nodded and walked to the staff room. She retrieved her jacket from her locker, and her thumb unconsciously traced the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the worn fabric so soft it was barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. The 75th Regiment insignia, hidden where no one could see it. A reminder of who she really was, buried under layers of fabric and silence. As she passed the dining room on her way to the exit, Mercer whispered something to Vincent. She caught the phrase "a liability and your establishment," and then she was pushing through the doors into the Norfolk night air, where the wind carried the salt smell of the harbor and the sound of distant traffic. She didn't look back. She had learned long ago that looking back was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. What she didn't know was that a man in a booth near the kitchen had witnessed everything. Daniel Garrett, a civilian contractor with a brother in the military, had watched a young woman absorb a public humiliation with the kind of composure that only comes from training, from discipline, from experience. He had watched her wipe away one tear without flinching, without breaking. He had watched her speak a single sentence that suggested depths most people never encounter. And he had no idea that in 4 days, Rachel would save his life at this very restaurant, or that this act of mercy would trigger a cascade of events that would bring the full weight of the United States military down on everything Dr. Marcus Mercer had built. Tuesday evening at Salvatore's. The restaurant hummed with the sound of 7 o'clock dinner service, forks against china, wine glasses clinking, low conversations layered like sediment. Rachel moved through the dining room with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that invisibility was a survival skill. Table 6 needed water. Table 9 was ready to order. The couple in the corner booth had been staring at their menus for 3 minutes without looking up. She'd seen 1,000 variations of that particular paralysis. The cardboard box was still in her car. She'd picked it up from her locker 2 hours earlier, the cracked World's Okayest Nurse mug, the dying succulent, the photograph from Ramadi where half the faces were no longer breathing. Her supervisor had escorted her out like she was contaminated. The word had come down from the Virginia Board of Medicine at 9 that morning: license revocation. Practicing medicine outside her scope of authority. Performing an invasive procedure while under suspension. All because she'd kept a man alive. Rachel didn't think about that now. Thinking made the jaw clench, and the jaw clench showed. Instead, she focused on the bread basket at table 8 and the elderly couple at table 3 who ordered the same meal every Tuesday and left exactly 18% gratuity. The work was simple. The work was honest. The work didn't require anyone to know who she was. 2 tables over from where Rachel was clearing plates, a man in his early 30s sat alone at a foretop, pushing pasta around with a fork he wasn't eating with. Gaunt. The kind of thin that comes from something medical rather than something chosen. His name was Daniel Garrett, though Rachel didn't know that yet. She would learn it from the paramedics. What she noticed first was the color of his skin, a shade of gray that usually precedes something final. He set down his fork, pressed his hand against his chest. Rachel was 6 feet away when she saw his breathing change. Not faster. Shallower. The kind of breathing that happens when the lungs can't find space because something else is taking up the room. She moved without deciding to move. Muscle memory that had nothing to do with working restaurant tables and everything to do with watching a Phi-base medic die in her arms because the field surgical team was 47 kilometers away. His neck veins were distended, rope thick and pulsing. His breath sounds were absent, not diminished, absent. Like someone had switched off the volume on half his body. Tension pneumothorax. Rachel knelt beside his chair as his eyes went wide. "I'm a nurse," she said. "We need a needle. Now." The restaurant manager appeared, face reddening. "You need to step away from the customer. We've called 911. He'll be dead before they arrive." Rachel's voice didn't carry anger or frustration. It carried the same flat precision she'd used in field conditions when time was measured in heartbeats. "I need a small knife. Vodka from the bar. A ballpoint pen." "Absolutely not. I will not have you practicing medicine in my restaurant." Rachel was already moving. She didn't ask again. She retrieved a paring knife from the kitchen, returned to Daniel Garrett, and sterilized the blade with Tito's from the bar, the vodka burning away bacteria in a cloud of alcohol vapor. Around them, diners had stopped moving. Phones appeared. Someone was filming. Rachel had stopped caring about phones and witnesses sometime around her second tour. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomical landmark where the lung had collapsed enough to push his heart sideways. Her fingers marked the spot. The knife was cold. His skin was colder. "This is going to save your life," Rachel said, and she meant it like a promise. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was like releasing a pressure valve on a submarine. Daniel Garrett's eyes went from panic to something like shock as his lungs found room to expand again. His breathing deepened. The gray started leaving his skin. Within 30 seconds, his oxygen saturation would have climbed. Rachel couldn't see the monitor, but she didn't need to. She could hear it in his breathing. Feel it in the way his body had stopped fighting itself. Paramedics arrived with sirens and equipment and the controlled urgency of people trained in crisis. Rachel stepped back. Let them take over. She'd done what she came to do. She was returning to the kitchen when the manager blocked her path. "You just committed a crime in my establishment," he said. His face was the color of raw beef. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling the medical board. I'm calling my attorney. You will never work in this city again." Rachel looked at him for 3 seconds without blinking. "He would have died," she said. "That was not your decision to make." 3 booths back, a man in an expensive suit had watched the entire exchange without moving. Dr. Marcus Mercer had come to Salvatore's for their Wednesday special on Tuesday night. He did that sometimes, for the planning that wasn't quite routine. He'd ordered the osso buco and a Barolo and sat with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd just won something significant. The board contact had called that afternoon to confirm the license revocation was finalized. The administrator had received his courtesy notice about Rachel's liability exposure. Everything was moving like a machine with fresh oil. Then he watched a temp nurse in a restaurant save a man's life using a knife and a pen. Mercer had spent the last 3 weeks convinced he'd been watching Rachel's final act of relevance. He'd thought she was closing out, moving on, her name about to be a cautionary tale in hospital break rooms. But he'd just watched her move with the certainty of someone whose hands knew exactly what to do. He'd seen the focus in her face, not panic, not hesitation. Competence. The same kind of competence that made people compare her favorably to his tenured staff, that made patients request her specifically, that made him feel like an administrator rather than a leader. And now she'd performed an invasive procedure while under suspension, in front of witnesses, in a civilian establishment, outside any scope of medical authority. Mercer didn't finish his osso buco. He paid the bill, left the restaurant, and made his first call in the parking lot, standing in the salt marsh breeze that carried the smell of the Elizabeth River. His contact at the Virginia Board of Medicine picked up on the second ring. "This is Dr. Mercer." His voice was calm. "Reasonable. I'm reporting a violation of license suspension. Former Norfolk Memorial employee, Rachel Torres. She performed needle decompression on a civilian patient at Salvatore's restaurant, approximately 7:15 p.m. this evening. Multiple witnesses. I can provide statements." The voice on the other end confirmed the pattern. More documentation. More foundation. It was happening fast now, which was exactly how these things worked when you had the right allies. Call 2 came as Mercer was pulling onto Military Highway. The VA hospital administrator picked up before the phone completed its first ring. They did that when your number came through. Mercer explained the situation with professional concern. "I'm informing you because your contract nurse just created significant liability exposure at a civilian establishment. If it comes to litigation, the hospital's insurance may not cover her action since she was operating outside authorized scope. You may want to document this for your records and her file." The administrator said he'd look into it. Mercer knew he would. Call 3 was to the lawyer, James Caldwell, who owed Mercer a favor from a malpractice defense 2 years ago. This one was shorter. "I need documentation prepared that needle decompression performed by an unlicensed individual on a civilian patient constitutes practicing medicine without a license. Can you have that by morning?" Caldwell said yes. Caldwell always said yes. Call 4 came at 8:44 p.m., when Mercer was back in his office at the hospital, sitting in the leather chair he'd paid for himself. The private investigator picked up on the first ring. These men always did. "I need you to access sealed military records," Mercer said. "Name is Rachel Torres. Former service, location classified. I need to know why her records are sealed and what she did that warranted classification. If there's anything questionable in there, anything that shows poor judgment or instability, I want copies." The private investigator said it would cost. Mercer said that wasn't a problem. He ended the call and sat in the quiet of his office, where the only sound was the fluorescent lights buzzing with the hum of power. By tomorrow morning, there would be documentation. By tomorrow afternoon, there would be conclusions. The board had already issued the license revocation. Now he just had to make sure it stuck. What he didn't know was that Rachel wasn't going home. She wasn't sitting in her apartment processing what had happened. She was driving to Norfolk Memorial VA Hospital because Captain Rachel Torres still had a mission, and missions didn't get cancelled just because civilian licenses got revoked. She arrived at 11:12 p.m., parking in the employee lot she no longer had authorization to use. The badge that normally got her through the staff entrance was still in her pocket. Old habits. The head nurse was waiting at the ICU entrance like someone had called ahead. Someone had, of course. Pentagon handlers moved fast when things broke down. "You're to clear out your locker," the head nurse said. No preamble. No sympathy. Just the clinical delivery of bad news. "The board formalized your license revocation this morning. Practicing medicine during suspension." Rachel didn't defend herself. Defending was for people with time and lawyers and futures that hadn't already been filed away in sealed envelopes. "I saved a man's life. You broke the law." The head nurse's voice wasn't cruel. That would have been easier. Cruelty at least acknowledged you mattered enough to hate. This was institutional. Clinical. Security's waiting at your locker. The walk down the corridor felt longer than it had any right to. The lights were fluorescent, the walls were beige, the smell was the standard hospital cocktail of antiseptic and recirculated air that never quite felt like breathing. Her locker was in the nurse's station. Rachel had put the cracked mug there on her first day, the succulent on her second, the photograph from Ramadi when she was alone at night and certain no one was watching. She gathered them into a cardboard box with the methodical precision of someone packing up a temporary life. Which it was. Which it had always been. As they walked her toward the exit, she passed room 417. Through the window, she could see Kyle Brennan, Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan, Army Ranger, medic, the man she'd been assigned to monitor because he carried intelligence that 3 different federal agencies wanted to debrief. His face was turned toward the door. His eyes met hers. He knew. The protocol had been simple: complete the medical evaluation, confirm he was stable enough for transfer, hand off to the Pentagon liaison, disappear. But now he was still here and she was leaving with a box of personal effects and a revoked license, and the handoff had failed because everything was burning. The afternoon rain came hard enough to sound like drumming on her car roof. Rachel sat at a bus stop 3 blocks from the hospital, holding the cardboard box because her hands needed something to hold. The cracked mug was visible on top. The succulent drooped like it had finally given up. The photograph showed 5 Rangers, all of them young, all of them alive in that moment, half of them not alive anymore. Her phone buzzed. Pentagon handler. The message was 4 words: patient transferred to Walter Reed. She read it 3 times. Walter Reed meant escalated security. Walter Reed meant the intelligence was valuable enough that 3 agencies had decided he was too exposed at a civilian VA hospital. Walter Reed meant the cover was officially burned and the mission was officially dead. Rachel sat in the rain, and for the first time in the entire operation, for the first time in the weeks of degradation from Dr. Mercer, the campaigns of humiliation, the restaurant incident that had severed her last connection to legitimate nursing, her composure didn't crack. It shattered. Not into tears. Not into sound. Into something much deeper, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd been here before, who'd lost teammates in worse ways, who understood that extraction failures meant the people you were protecting would still be vulnerable after you were gone. Her thumb found the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only piece of the 75th Regiment she'd carried forward, the only thing that proved she'd ever been anyone other than a temp nurse with a revoked license. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Marcus Mercer didn't know any of this. The worst part was that he'd just destroyed a classified national security operation because he couldn't tolerate competence he didn't control. The worst part was that he had no idea what was about to walk through the doors of his hospital. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the State Medical Board's formal decision arrived in Rachel's inbox. Not a phone call, not a conversation, just a single PDF with her name highlighted in administrative red. License revoked. Effective immediately. The letterhead cited practicing medicine outside scope of licensure during active suspension, which was technically accurate and completely missing the point. Dr. Mercer had made 4 phone calls before dessert ended. 1 to the board. 1 to the VA hospital administrator. 1 to a lawyer who owed him favors. 1 to a private investigator. By midnight, he had activated every institutional lever he controlled, and by morning, Rachel Torres no longer existed as a licensed healthcare provider in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The second blow came at 06 for 7 hours, a classified message on the Pentagon burner phone she kept in her jacket pocket. 1 sentence: cover assignment terminated. Handler reassigned. Stand by for further contact. The intelligence officer she'd been protecting, Kyle Brennan, the Ranger medic with the shrapnel scars embedded in his left shoulder, had been transferred to Walter Reed under tighter security protocols before she could complete the handoff. 3 days. She'd needed 3 more days to pass him to his permanent handler. 12 years of operations, hundreds of successful handoffs, and this one had burned completely because a man in a hospital couldn't tolerate competence he didn't create. Rachel stood at the rain-soaked bus stop on Granby Street, holding a cardboard box that contained her entire professional existence. A cracked coffee mug, the one from the hospital break room that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, sat on top. Beneath it, a succulent with brown leaves curling inward, dying slowly like everything else she'd touched in this assignment. The photo was at the bottom, protected between the mug and the box itself, her Ranger medic team in Ramadi, 2019, all 8 faces sunburned and grinning. 4 of them were gone now. 2 killed in action. 2 by suicide after they came home. The rain hammered the cardboard like applause, and Rachel didn't move. She'd been in worse positions. She'd been in positions where the odds of survival were measured in single digits. She'd held arterial pressure on a Marine with an IED wound while waiting for a dust-off that came in under effective fire. She'd performed a cricothyrotomy with a trauma shears and a penlight in the back of a Humvee moving at 40 miles per hour. She'd seen things that made this moment feel like a minor administrative inconvenience, which meant her body chemistry was lying to her brain, flooding her system with cortisol and adrenaline while her face remained perfectly still. The rain came down harder. A man approaching 40, wearing a suit worth more than Rachel's monthly rent, opened an umbrella as he passed. He didn't look at her. No one looked at her. This was the point of the suspension, the revocation, the burned cover. She was supposed to disappear. Dr. Mercer had accomplished exactly what he set out to do, removed her from every institutional system that had ever validated her existence. The military records were sealed. The hospital had no official record of her. The nursing license was gone. What remained was a woman in the rain holding a box of dead plants and photographs of people who no longer existed. 300 miles north at Norfolk General Hospital, Daniel Garrett woke at 08 for 2 hours with a clear head and functional lungs for the first time since the restaurant. His heart monitor showed perfect sinus rhythm. His oxygen saturation was 98% on room air. The needle decompression had worked exactly as intended, the pressure had released, his collapsed lung had re-expanded, and the portable chest X-ray at 0600 showed no additional complications. What it also showed was a 2-star admiral sitting in the visitor's chair, uniform pressed to knife-edge precision, reading a classified briefing on a secure tablet. Rear Admiral James Garrett, commanding officer of Carrier Strike Group 12, had arrived by helicopter at 2,100 hours the previous night. His brother's collapse at a civilian restaurant while traveling on Navy business triggered an automatic security review. Standard protocol. Routine investigation. Except routine investigations don't involve Pentagon personnel command cross-referencing everyone present at the scene against active clearance databases, and they don't result in the kind of queries that cascade into need-to-know classifications that only 3-star officers and above could authorize. The woman who saved your life, Admiral Garrett said without looking up from the tablet. We need to locate her. Daniel's voice came out hoarse, the breathing tube hadn't done his vocal cords any favors. She knew exactly what she was doing. That wasn't first aid training. That was combat medicine. The Admiral set the tablet down carefully, the way operators do when they're processing information that doesn't fit the briefing. Tell me exactly what she did. Daniel described it, the speed of her assessment, the borrowed pocket knife, the vodka sterilization, the precise location of the needle insertion, the way she'd stayed calm while the restaurant manager screamed about liability. He described the way her hands moved like they'd done this 100 times before. He described the moment her eyes met his, and something in her expression shifted from competence into absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that only comes from muscle memory measured in lives saved. The Admiral listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, he picked up the tablet again and made a single phone call. I need everything you have on an employee named Rachel Torres. Norfolk, Virginia. And I need to know why a security review of a classified contractor just got kicked back as need to know only. He listened for 43 seconds. His expression didn't change. Understood. She's still tagged as active. Another pause. Then someone's handler burned the whole operation. Find out who and find out why. He ended the call and looked at his brother. You're being discharged this morning against medical advice. We're driving to Norfolk Memorial VA Hospital. By noon, Admiral Garrett and Daniel had standing in front of a Veterans Memorial wall in Norfolk Memorial's main lobby, a plaque-lined corridor that most staff walked past without seeing. The citations were arranged chronologically, stretching back to the hospital's founding. Most were Bronze Stars and Navy Commendation Medals. The one they found was different, a Silver Star citation for Captain Rachel Torres, dated 2019, 2 lines of description, for gallantry and intrepidity in action against enemy forces. Combat Medicine, Ramadi Sector, above and beyond the call of duty. Admiral Garrett photographed it with his phone and sent it to an encrypted address. She's officer level, he said quietly. And that's not administrative Silver Star. That's in combat Silver Star. She saved lives under fire. They took the elevator to the 4th floor, room 417. Kyle Brennan sat up when they entered, not surprised, exactly, but the kind of alert that only comes from training. Trained men recognize trained men, and they recognize trained women, and Kyle Brennan recognized something in Admiral Garrett's bearing that triggered every security protocol in his operational memory. Daniel spoke first. I'm the man you saved at Salvatore's. My brother's a Navy officer. We're trying to locate the nurse who... You're looking for Viper 6, Kyle interrupted. His voice carried the rasp of recent trauma, but his eyes were clear. She was my unit commander before I rotated in. Admiral Garrett went very still. Viper 6 is a 75th Regiment call sign. Yes, sir. Kyle's eye shifted to the Admiral's collar insignia. He registered the stars without comment. Captain Torres. She ran emergency medicine for our Phi-base team, 2019 to 2021. Ramadi Sector. She was the only reason 3 of us made it out of the Jolan district collapse. The Admiral's phone buzzed. A secure message. He read it once, then again, and something shifted in his operational focus. Why is a decorated Army Ranger working as a temp nurse at a Norfolk restaurant? Before Kyle could answer, the hospital room door opened. A Pentagon liaison in civilian clothes entered first, mid-40s, the kind of invisible that only comes from years in intelligence work. Behind him came a Marine in dress uniform, dress blues sharp enough to cut, and carrying something that looked like a secure tablet. Admiral, the liaison said, acknowledging the rank with a nod. Captain Torres was on an active intelligence protection detail. This patient, he gestured to Kyle, is currently carrying classified debriefings. She was assigned to this location under deep cover until handoff protocol completion. Handoff to who? Admiral Garrett's voice had dropped into command register, the tone that didn't request information, it extracted it. The Marine stepped forward with the tablet. Silver Star for actions under fire, 2019. Bronze Star with Valor, 2020. 2 Purple Hearts, same deployment. Kyle Brennan spoke quietly, his voice moving into something that sounded like testimony. She took shrapnel pulling me and 2 other Rangers out of a collapsed structure. That tremor in her hands, the one you probably didn't notice because she's trained to compensate, that's nerve damage from fragmentation. Left radial and ulnar nerves. The room held silence for 11 seconds. Daniel Garrett's recovery had been textbook, but he was comprehending, in real time, that the woman who'd saved his life had also sacrificed her own nervous system to save the lives of soldiers. The Admiral's jawline tightened, barely visible, just a small muscle contraction that indicated he understood exactly how the pieces were interlocking. Where is she now? Daniel asked. Relieved of duty, the liaison said. License revoked. Cover burned as of this morning. She completed the emergency medical intervention, which exposed her identity to a civilian hospital administrator who had no security clearance and personal motivations to weaponize that exposure. The hospital room door slammed open with enough force to rattle the monitor stand. Dr. Mercer entered, carrying printed documentation, his face flushed with the kind of righteous anger that only comes from a man who believed he'd won and was about to collect his prize. I'm filing a permanent restraining order to keep Rachel Torres off hospital grounds for. He stopped. He saw the Admiral's 2 stars. The Pentagon liaison. The Marine in dress blues. The secure tablet. His momentum collapsed. Dr. Mercer, the liaison said, not a question. He turned to the Marine. You have it. The Marine handed over a USB drive. Behind him, the hospital's IT specialist appeared in the doorway, a stocky man with a Marine Corps veteran's cap and the kind of bearing that came from having survived things that never made it into official reports. Sir, you asked me to deliver the digital evidence. His voice was flat, professional, the way Marines talk when they're looking at betrayal. The liaison inserted the USB drive into the secure tablet. The screen filled with footage, Mercer at a hospital computer terminal, access logs timestamped 2:17 a.m. Mercer on his phone in his car outside Salvatore's, his face visible through the restaurant window as he animated his theft of classified personnel records. Mercer meeting with the private investigator in a parking garage, handing over information obtained through illegal access to sealed files. The footage showed date stamps, access logs, his own voice captured on security audio describing Rachel Torres' military background to the PI. You access sealed personnel files, the liaison said. You attempted to delete records at 0217 hours. You contacted at least for individuals with material information obtained through illegal access to classified systems. You deliberately burned an active Pentagon operation. The Marine veteran IT specialist looked at Mercer with something that transcended contempt. She was one of ours. Combat veteran. Decorated. You didn't just destroy a nurse's career. You destroyed a national security operation because you couldn't handle the fact that she earned respect without a resume credential list. He paused. That's not professional conduct. That's treason adjacent, and I made sure the Inspector General's office has everything. Admiral Garrett took the USB drive and held it with the kind of careful deliberation usually reserved for ordnance. You also burned my brother's security clearance by exposing him to unauthorized personnel and compromised an active intelligence protection detail to settle a personal grudge. His voice was perfectly level. I'm going to make some phone calls, and those calls are going to cascade through every institutional system you've ever accessed. By the time this filters through Naval Criminal Investigative Service, the Virginia Board of Medicine, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you won't teach CPR at a community college for minimum wage because that will be the only employment you'll ever find. The liaison stepped forward. Effective immediately, you're suspended from all hospital duties pending formal investigation. Dr. Mercer's face had gone the color of old concrete. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out, the look of a man watching his entire career architecture collapse in real time, understanding finally, catastrophically, that he'd been playing checkers against players who understood multidimensional strategy. Daniel Garrett discharged himself against medical advice at 11:56 a.m. on a Tuesday, moving through the hospital corridors with the careful deliberation of a man relearning his own body. The chest tubes were gone. The oxygen had dropped to room air. The cardiothoracic surgeon had signed off with visible reluctance, muttering something about stubbornness running in the family. Daniel didn't care. He needed to find the nurse who'd pulled him back from the edge at Salvatore's, the one who'd moved like someone who'd done impossible things before and expected to do them again. At the information desk, he asked for the temp nurse. The woman behind the counter, older, kind eyes, the kind of tired that comes from 20 years of directing lost people, made a call. Got transferred twice. Then, room for 17. 4th floor. But she's not here anymore. She was suspended. Daniel's jaw tightened. He went anyway. Climbed the stairs because elevators felt like giving up. The door to 417 opened to a man in an Army Ranger PT uniform, sitting on the hospital bed, doing nothing but staring out the window. Kyle Brennan? Daniel asked. They'd been briefed on the patient. Classified tasking, off-book recovery, intelligence value that required 3 different agencies to coordinate his medical care. Kyle turned. Took in Daniel's civilian clothes, the careful way he was moving, the faint scar visible on his neck where the surgical team had made their incision. Recognition flickered. "You're the contractor from Salvatore's. Daniel Garrett. Admiral's brother." He sat down carefully in the visitor's chair, every movement deliberate. "The woman who saved my life. Her name is Rachel Torres, isn't it?" Kyle's face went still, the kind of still that comes from trained operators who've learned that information leaks from micro-expressions. "You're looking for Viper 6, he said quietly. The doors opened. Admiral James Garrett filled the frame like a man accustomed to gravity bending around his presence. Two-star general, service record that read like a classified novel, the kind of command presence that made lieutenants straighten their spines without being told. Behind him, a man in a Pentagon liaison suit carried a tablet the way other men carry weapons. The Admiral walked directly to the hospital lobby's bulletin board, where citations hung in frames like medals. He read aloud, "Captain Rachel Torres, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment. Silver Star. For acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty in combat medical operations, Ramadi Sector, Al-Anbar Province, 2011. Rendered life-saving aid under heavy fire. Sustained injuries in the performance of duty." He turned back to Daniel and Kyle. "Did either of you know you were being saved by a decorated combat veteran?" The answer died in the silence before they could speak it. The door to 417 burst inward. Marcus Mercer, his face the color of ash, his voice pitched high and fractured, "I've already filed a restraining order. She is not authorized to be on hospital grounds. I'm calling security. Sit down." The Admiral's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Mercer stopped mid-sentence. His mouth kept moving, but no sound came out, the expression of a man watching the ground give way beneath him in real time. The Pentagon liaison stepped forward, tablet raised. On the screen, security footage played in silent, damning sequence. Mercer's badge accessing the classified personnel record system at 2:14 a.m. Mercer again at 3:51 a.m., attempting to delete files, the system's failsafe blocking him, logging every keystroke. Mercer's phone in his hand at the Salvatore's bar, making calls, his lips moving in conversation with board members, fabricating evidence, painting Rachel as a danger, a fraud, a liability. Unauthorized access to classified intelligence records, the liaison said. Attempted destruction of federal documents. Conspiracy to interfere with military personnel assigned to active operations. Perjury before a state medical board. He swiped. New footage. Hospital IT flagged your illegal access 12 hours after you initiated it. You were never going to get away with this. The Marine veteran IT specialist stood by the door in dress greens, the kind of quiet that comes from people who've learned that surveillance is not privacy, it's just documentation of what people are actually like when they think no one's watching. "I filed the report with the Inspector General's office personally," he said. 0600 hours. With copies. Hospital legal counsel entered, a woman with grey streaking her temples and the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years cutting through institutional bullshit. She didn't sit. Standing was enough. 17 formal complaints from staff regarding your conduct toward Captain Torres. 3 patients have filed statements alleging you fabricated medication errors that never occurred. 1 patient, Maria Hernandez, room 312, has provided her nursing notes documenting that her medication was administered correctly and that you altered her chart. Mercer's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Buzzed again. Again. Each vibration landing like a percussion strike, Virginia Board of Medicine. His lawyer texting, the message visible even from across the room, "Can't help. Conflict of interest." His wife, the hospital called. "We're done. Your nursing license suspension is effective immediately pending criminal review," legal counsel said. "You will surrender your credentials and badge before leaving this building." Mercer stood. The chair toppled backward, wood on tile, and he pointed at Rachel's name, at Kyle in the hospital bed, at the Admiral with the weight of command hanging from his uniform like gravity made visible. "She performed an unlicensed medical procedure. That's a felony. She violated every protocol. The 9/11 tape, the IT specialist interrupted, pulling it up on the liaison's tablet, shows the paramedics' assessment on arrival. Patient would not have survived transport without emergency decompression. Estimated time to cardiac arrest, 60 seconds at current O2 saturation. Captain Torres prevented that arrest with precise technical application under combat conditions. He paused. I was a combat medic in Kandahar. What she did in that restaurant, in front of civilians, with a borrowed knife and a pen. That was the most disciplined emergency medicine I've ever seen. The Admiral leaned forward, his voice dropping into the register he perfected across for decades of command. You targeted a decorated combat veteran because she was better at her job than you. You compromised a classified intelligence operation because your ego couldn't tolerate that reality. And you're going to stand here and lecture me about protocol? Mercer's hand shook. His voice cracked into something almost pleading. I want immunity. I'll cooperate fully. You don't have anything we need, the Admiral said. We have everything. Security arrived 15 minutes later. Not hard, not violent, just efficient. They walked Mercer through the corridors while staff watched without watching, the precise kind of invisible that comes from professional courtesy extended to the fallen. His name placard came off the door. His credentials came off the wall. His access badge, when he tried to exit the parking garage, beeped red and denied. He sat in his car for an hour, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching people walk past without seeing him, the same erasure he'd forced onto Rachel, the same social death he'd engineered with whispered lies and red-highlighted names. 6 months later, a ceremony at the Pentagon. 20 people in a room with ceilings so high they seemed to belong to a cathedral rather than a government building. Rachel Torres stood in army dress blues, the fabric sharp against her skin, the insignia on her shoulder announcing rank and service to anyone who knew how to read it. Admiral Garrett pinned a commendation to her uniform for distinguished service in intelligence operations under hostile conditions, conducted at grave personal risk. Kyle Brennan stood in the front row in dress uniform, recovered, whole, the intelligence he'd carried having been successfully transferred through the debriefing protocol that Rachel's undercover nursing assignment had enabled. A smuggling network that had been targeting veteran medical records, intercepted because she'd maintained her cover, her composure, her silence, even when her reputation was being dismantled in the break room and the medical board. The citation was read aloud, Ramadi. Shrapnel wound sustained while rendering aid to other combat personnel. 18-month undercover assignment penetrating a major teaching hospital for intelligence purposes. Cover compromised by civilian retaliation. Mission completed despite operational sabotage. Her hands, the citation noted, had held lives together. Not just in the immediate moment, across months, across systems, across the careful architecture of classified operations that required someone who could maintain perfect discipline under institutional pressure. After the ceremony, Daniel Garrett approached her, walking without assistance, his chest scarred but whole. You gave me my life back. Rachel smiled, the first genuine smile that broke through her disciplined composure, a smile that contained 18 years of military service and 6 months of rain-soaked parking lots and cardboard boxes. That's what we do. Admiral Garrett gestured toward the door. The Virginia Board of Medicine has formally apologized and restored your license. Seattle General has offered you Chief of Emergency Medicine. Rachel considered, her hand resting on the patch inside her jacket lining, the faded 75th Regiment insignia that she'd finally removed, finally allowed herself to stop hiding. I appreciate it, sir. But I think I'm done with hospitals for a while. There's a veterans clinic in Norfolk. No bureaucracy. Just medicine. People who've seen what we've seen. That's where I need to be. Kyle approached and saluted, fist to chest, the gesture of one soldier honoring another. Half the team is stateside. We've been talking about a reunion. Rachel's eyes misted. I'd like that, Sergeant. A Norfolk Community College, basement classroom, fluorescent lights humming their electric prayer. Dr. Marcus Mercer demonstrated CPR compressions on a plastic dummy to 8 students, none of whom were paying attention. The pay was $18 an hour. No benefits. No credentials on the wall. No one to defer to him, and no one to supervise. Just him and a dummy, and the knowledge that every person in that room pitied him, though they didn't know why. Through the small window in the classroom door, he could see the parking lot. A car pulled up. A woman in civilian clothes, dark hair pulled back, the kind of grace that comes from military bearing worn into bone. She didn't see him. She walked toward the building next door, the veterans clinic that had opened 6 months ago. He stopped mid-compression, staring, understanding finally that Rachel Torres had not just survived his retaliation. She'd been transformed by it. She'd taken the moment he designed to destroy her and used it to become something larger, something that couldn't be contained in a hospital or a break room or beneath the thumb of a man who'd mistaken competence for arrogance. He looked at the dummy, at his hands, at the lights he'd once commanded others beneath. So, one of the students raised her hand. "Are we done?" "Yeah," Mercer said quietly. "We're done." The Veterans Clinic occupied a converted storefront on East Main Street. Half a dozen former soldiers, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, stood when Rachel entered. No saluting, not here, not in civilian space. Just standing, the way you honor someone who'd carried weight you couldn't measure in pounds or meters. Her office held the photo from Ramadi, the faces half of whom were gone now, finally placed on the wall where she could see it every day. The cracked mug reading "The World's Okayest Nurse" held her pens. The succulent, against all odds, had bloomed. She sat at her desk and didn't take a breath of relief, not yet, not for another 5 minutes, until she was sure no one could hear it. Then she allowed herself one long exhale, held it, and began the work of healing people who understood that sometimes the bravest things you do are invisible, unwitnessed, and absolutely necessary. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.